Hello, everyone. Welcome to the podcast. Before we get started today, I just wanted to invite you to attend a class that I'm teaching this summer for adults on the Iliad. We will start in June and end in middle of July, and we'll just be reading the book together. This is actually a book that I've been teaching for a long time. I'm a classical educator, and I truly believe in lifelong learning. And so if you've never read it before, it was the first book, basically, that we have in Western civilization, and it's about war. Go figure, right? And it's incredible. And it's just, I think that you'll really like it. Even if you read it as a child, in middle school, like you may have been familiar with the story, but if you've never read the actual epic poem before, it's amazing. So I want to invite you to take the class. It's also just a great way to support me and the podcast. I know I don't do a lot of podcasts anymore, but it really does help me when people who listen to the podcast are willing to take classes and enroll in the classes. Not only can you meet other people and learn a lot, but you can support the podcast by doing it because you're supporting me, and I really appreciate it. Simone Weil was a Jewish woman who was very attracted to the Catholic Church, and she never actually officially converted, but she loved the church, and she was very interested in Christianity, and she was a pacifist, soldier, mystic, philosopher. She was just an incredible woman. But she wrote a brilliant essay, which we'll read in the class, called The Iliad, the Poem of Force. And she says something to the effect of, I should have it memorized by now, she says, nothing, I'll paraphrase, nothing that anyone in the West has since created has been worth as much as the first poem to be produced among them. In other words, she's saying nothing that has come out of the West has equaled the Iliad. Like the Sistine Chapel, cookie dough ice cream, like nothing is important and valuable, and nothing beats the Iliad, which was kind of the first artifact of Western civilization. So she thought very highly of the book. I think very highly of the book, and I invite you to come read it with me this summer and learn about it. So there's a link down below, and we'll go ahead and get started with today's podcast. Thank you. Hello, everyone. Welcome to episode 115 of the Catholics Against Militarism podcast. My name is Ellen, and I am wearing my Crusader outfit today. The things I do for this podcast, I'm telling you, this thing is like legitimate, like chains, and it's like definitely ruining my hair right now. But I wanted to get your attention, so I'm wearing it. I'm hoping a few more people might click on the video. What we're going to talk about today is the teachings of the Catholic Church on war, and the thesis, my argument in this video, is that they are not clear. And I am writing this, I don't have a lot of time to prepare my podcast these days, so it's kind of on the fly. You're just going to have to kind of bear with me here. I am writing this I'm creating this video in response to an article that was published in Crisis magazine called Pope Francis's Condemnation of Gaza Genocide Reflects Traditional Catholic Doctrine. It was written on published on March 17th, 2025, written by Matthew Cullinan Hoffman. And his whole thesis here is he's defending Pope Francis's statements, condemning Israel's actions, and he's saying that they are well-founded and not unjustified. And he says Pope Francis's statements are very much in keeping with the facts, Catholic moral teaching, and the historic views of the popes. He also mentions the clear teaching of the Catholic Church. What I'm taking issue with here is the idea that the teachings of the Catholic Church on war are clear. I don't think they are, and I want to walk through some of these teachings in the Catechism and show you why they are not clear. Let's just start with, if one was to not know anything about the Church's teachings on war, you could pick up a catechism and you could flip to the back and you could go to war. War and the moral law, arms race, disorders threatening peace, duty to prevent war, just war. I say that all of this stuff about war is turning up in the section 2300. So let's just say that I flipped to section 2300. And if you have a catechism at home, you should just do this with me. A little study session together. 2300. Okay, well, I looked up war, but now when I actually turn to it, it says avoiding war. Right here. Avoiding war. Okay. All right, war. Now we were talking about war. Now we're talking about avoiding war. Okay. So 2307. The Fifth Commandment forbids the intentional destruction of human life. That's the first sentence that I read. Interesting. Intentional destruction of human life. That's a key word, intentional. Intentional destruction. So what is the Fifth Commandment? We probably remember that the Fifth Commandment is thou shalt not kill. Now, we've all heard it said. We don't really know. We've heard it said many times in our lives. Well, it actually doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder. There's a difference between killing and murder. If I was to verify that in the Catechism, that might be a good idea at this point, right? Because the very first sentence under avoiding war talks about the Fifth Commandment, and I've always been told, and here's this key word, intentional. So the Fifth Commandment forbids the intentional destruction of human life, but that doesn't really say the Fifth Commandment forbids murder. So is murder the intentional destruction of human life? That's a good question. I mean, it's because I'm thinking, well, murder, killing, intention. How does intention figure into murder and killing? So at this point, I might stop and say, you know what? I'm gonna take a pause and I'm gonna go look up the Fifth Commandment in the Catechism and see what it says. Does it say killing? Does it say murder? Does it say something about intention? How can I make sense of this? So I'm going to go and I'm going to look it up, and I see that the Fifth Commandment is on page 602. The Fifth Commandment, you shall not kill. I've heard a lot of people say, oh, if you look back at the ancient Greek or ancient Hebrew, it actually says murder. I don't think so. I have done a little bit of research on this. The word is kill. And honestly, if the word wasn't kill, we would put murder here, because the Catechism is more than aware that there's another word called murder. And if they believed that it should be translated as murder, they would put that here. They would say, you shall not murder, but they say kill. Okay, so now we're dealing with two different terms. Okay, and then it has a little footnote. You can reference Exodus and Deuteronomy. Okay, well, I'm not going to go quite that far. I could go look up the Old Testament, but I'm kind of hoping that the teachings of the Catholic Church can help me to make sense of what's in the Old Testament, right? So it says, you shall not kill. You have heard that it was said to men of old, you shall not kill, but whoever kills shall be liable to judgment. But I say to you that everyone who is angry with his brother shall be liable to judgment. Heard it a million times in Mass. I'm on board with that. Okay. And that references Matthew 5:21-22. Okay. I know Jesus said that, but what is the Catholic Church going to tell me? 22:58. Human life is sacred because from its beginning it involves the creative action of God, and it remains forever in special relationship with the Creator, who is its sole end. Makes sense? Human life is sacred. I've always been taught that. God alone is the Lord of life from its beginning until its end. No one can, under any circumstance, claim for himself the right to directly destroy an innocent human being. Okay, so in the other part of the Catechism, it had something about the intentional destruction of human life. Now that I'm looking up the Fifth Commandment to try to understand the difference between killing and murder, or if there is a difference, all of a sudden these words direct are there. So I can't claim the right directly to destroy. It's interesting because it doesn't say I can't claim the right to directly destroy. It's kind of weirdly worded. I can't claim the right directly to destroy. What does it mean to declare a right directly? Like, I don't know, but I think they mean direct killing. I don't know. So now we have direct. What does that word mean? And then innocent human being. So we can't directly destroy an innocent human being. So here we have 2307, the Fifth Commandment forbids the intentional destruction of human life. That's how the Fifth Commandment is defined, even though they don't use either the word kill or murder. So the question was, does the Bible say kill or murder? We decided it does say kill. The next question is murder defined as the intentional destruction of human life? How do I relate what's in 2307 of the Catechism to the Fifth Commandment? What's the relationship there? The answer, we don't know yet. They haven't explicitly told us what murder is. So we're going to go with killing, because That's what we're given. Okay, so then the question is, what is the relationship between killing, murder, and the intentional destruction of human life? It's unclear. Section 2258, no one can under any circumstances claim for himself the right directly to destroy an innocent human being. The question, is intentional destruction the same as claiming for oneself directly the right to destroy an innocent human being? What are the relationships between these statements? Is intentional the same as direct? What's the difference? Can one claim for oneself the right indirectly to kill an innocent human being? Now, I know what they're trying to do here. What this has to do with, I think, is collateral damage, right? You can't say that it's wrong to kill innocent life if you didn't mean to do it, according to the Catechism. So they've got to slip in the idea of direct versus indirect. But so there's different things going on here. There's intention, there's innocence, there's direct versus indirect. And it would seem to imply that one can claim for oneself the right indirectly to kill an innocent human being. So that would mean that killing the innocent is not always wrong. But we are definitely left to read between the lines there, because I don't think, at least not so far, we haven't seen them state that directly. Although we might claim the right. They might claim the right to be able to state it indirectly. I don't know. In the account of Abel's murder by his brother Cain, okay, now we have the word murder. So we know that whatever Cain did was actually murder. So under murder, I guess if I'm trying to figure this out, okay, Cain is an example of murder. In the account of Abel's murder by his brother Cain, Scripture reveals the presence of anger and envy in man. So murder has something to do with bad feelings. That kind of opens up the question, why bring it up if you're not going to explain it? If envy and anger are present when someone kills another person, does that make it murder and therefore wrong? Or can those bad feelings be present when somebody is killing somebody and it's not murder because it's not indirect, or because it's not intentional, or because the person isn't innocent? Again, what are the relationships between these statements? Envy and anger are present with murder. Consequences of original sin from the beginning of human history. Man has become the enemy of his fellow man. God declares the wickedness of this fratricide. What have you done? The voice of your brother's blood is crying to me from the ground, and now you are cursed from the ground, which has opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand. Okay. So there's wickedness and fratricide. So we have another word here that's being used. We have the new word of murder and associated with Cain and fratricide. The covenant 2260, the covenant between God and mankind is interwoven with reminders of God's gift of human life and man's murderous violence. Okay. We're reminded of murderous violence. So, for your lifeblood I will surely require a reckoning. Whoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed, for God made man in his own image. But here we don't have violence in 2260. We have murderous violence. So that must mean that there's some violence that's not murderous. Okay, 2261. Scripture specifies the prohibition contained in the Fifth Commandment. Do not slay the innocent and the righteous. Okay, so again, innocent comes up in 2261. We have another mention of innocent. But the deliberate murder of an innocent person, okay, now we have deliberate. Okay, so now in 2261 we have deliberate. That is different than direct, and that is different than intentional, right? They're three different words. So now we have a new word that's being introduced. And I've only read, by the way, I've read this part, and I've read this part. I've read 2 half pages, and I already have intentional, direct, deliberate, and I've also got 2 different words I'm trying to figure out: killing and murder. Do not slay the innocent and the righteous. The deliberate murder of an innocent person. Okay, wait a minute. The deliberate murder of an innocent person. Deliberate murder. But wouldn't murder itself always be deliberate? If it's murder, then isn't it always going to be? So now there's two kinds of murder. There's deliberate and not deliberate. Why are we using the word deliberate with murder, but we're using the word intentional with killing? Is there a difference between deliberate murder and intentional killing? And if so, what is it? I mean, it's possible that they were trying to use a thesaurus just to like confuse us, but I feel like usually the Catholic Church tries to be pretty precise with language. But yeah, why the two different terms? It's almost like they do better to like create a Venn diagram to show us like the relationships between these ideas, in my opinion. Of an innocent person, deliberate murder of an innocent person is gravely contrary to the dignity of human being, to the golden rule, and to the holiness of the Creator. I'll say. The law forbidding it is universally valid. It obliges each and everyone, always and everywhere. The law forbidding. So, what can we absolutely never do in any circumstance? I'm still trying to figure that out. It has to do something with being deliberate, direct, intentional, and of the innocent. And if we're really going to get into it, so is there such a thing as a non-deliberate murder of an innocent person? What is the relationship between deliberate, intentional, and direct? We don't have any definitions for these terms. The deliberate murder of an innocent person is gravely contrary to the dignity of the human being, to the golden rule, and to the holiness of the Creator. It begs the question, is the deliberate murder of an innocent person a sin? Because to say that something is gravely contrary to the dignity of the human being, to the golden rule, and to the holiness of the Creator, is that a sin? Or can you fall short of the golden rule and fall short of the holiness of the Creator and yet not be sinning? The law forbidding the deliberate murder of an innocent person is universally valid. It obliges each and everyone, but we already learned that there are times when it seems you can kill the innocent as long as it's not a right that you're directly claiming or something. Okay, so that's a lot of qualifiers right there for thou shalt not kill, don't you think? I mean, that's a lot of like, there's a lot of killing there's a lot of check boxes that you need to get to figure out what is universally valid and obliges each and everyone, always and everywhere. Okay, so just to recap so far, if we can try, thou shalt not kill. God said that. Unless the person is not innocent, unless it's unintentional killing of the innocent, as long as you have envy, anger, or vengeance in your heart. But even in some cases, if you have that in your heart, you might still be able to get away with it. We're not sure. Thou shalt not kill with murderous violence, only with non-murderous violence, i.e. if it's unintentional killing. But sometimes intentional killing is fine as long as it's not murder. The law forbidding the deliberate murder of an innocent person is universally valid. It obliges each and everyone, always and everywhere, unless you are claiming indirectly the right to kill the innocent. I guess that's okay, moving on. In the Sermon on the Mount, the Lord recalls the commandment, you shall not kill. Okay, now we're back to the word kill in 22:62. And adds to it the proscription of anger, hatred, and vengeance. Okay, so again, we're back to something about the way I feel inside when I'm doing the act of killing matters. That seems to be what this is saying. That it's also bad. Anger, hatred, and vengeance are also really bad. Mortal sins, actually. I think. Adds to it the proscription of anger, hatred, and vengeance. Going further, Christ asks his disciples to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies. He did not defend himself and told Peter to leave his sword in its sheath. Okay. All right, so we're sort of getting all this stuff about all these like exceptions to killing, all the different. It's very hard to figure out like what kind of killing is absolutely forbidden. But then we have 2262, which is like telling us you shall not kill. And again, we're not talking about murderous violence. We're not talking about deliberate murder. We're not talking about innocent people. We're just said we're back to using the word kill. And the relationship between murder and kill is not really made clear because in 2262, it doesn't say the Lord recalls the commandment, you shall not deliberately and directly murder the innocent. That's not what he said. And they don't use the word murder here. They use the word kill. Going further, Christ asks his disciples to turn the other cheek, to love their enemies. Love their enemies. So does loving my enemies have to do with how I feel about them? Like, I have to love them while I kill them by killing them without anger, hatred, and vengeance? That I can kill them without anger, hatred, and vengeance, and that's somehow okay? Or when he says love my enemies, what does that mean? The reference here is to footnote 63. It refers us back to the Gospels. So I guess, I don't know, are we completely left to figure that out by ourselves? There's a lot here about killing, but there's very little here about love of enemies, and there's nothing here except a reference to the gospel. And it's interesting that they tell us he did not defend himself and told Peter to leave his sword in its sheath. What does it reference? The Gospels. But what does that mean for us, right? What does that mean for it? There's a lot in here about killing, but there's very little about that. But it's like the Catechism is acknowledging Christ said these things, this is the way he did it. What comes next under the Fifth Commandment, Article 5, is something called legitimate defense. So right after it says Christ did not defend himself and told Peter, put down thy sword, whoever lives by the sword dies by the sword, he not only did he not defend himself, but he didn't seem to want Peter to defend him either. Right under that is something called legitimate defense. Oh, in case you're looking for clarification on this whole defense thing, let's clear that up. 2263. The legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition against the murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. Let's read that again. The legitimate defense of persons and societies is not an exception to the prohibition against the murder of the innocent that constitutes intentional killing. All right, I know what they're saying here. So basically what I'm keying in on here is murder of the innocent constitutes intentional killing. The word constitutes means to be a part of. So we're going to have to change the Venn diagram a little bit here, because now we know that that murder of the innocent is a part of what they're talking about when they talk about intentional killing. So they're to constitute, to be a part of. So that would mean that murder of the innocent goes in intentional killing. But that leaves the question, what about the non-deliberate murder question we had before? Where does that go? And what if one claims indirectly the right to kill the innocent? I mean, I know what they're saying here is like, you're not allowed to kill innocent people just because you're claiming that you're acting in legitimate self-defense, but still not clear. And again, they're building in the loophole for collateral damage. We all know that in war, especially since the 20th century, it's mostly civilians and innocent people who die. So they've got to have that loophole, because if you said you can't kill innocent people, then you basically couldn't fight in war. So, okay, it's killing. Intentional killing isn't always murder of the innocent, but then murder of the innocent, but then it's murder. It goes back to killing when it's unintentional or indirect or whatever. So by their use of words and incredible acts of equivocation where they're switching things in and out, they seem to be implying here that there is a difference between murder and killing. And yet they're not going so far as to say that it should be translated, thou shalt not murder. So they won't go that far to actually address what it says in Scripture, and address they're kind of glossing over all of the words of Christ here. But then through their use of words, they're kind of implying and insinuating that there is a difference. I don't know, but they're basically saying that when we carve out of this prohibition the legitimate defense of persons and societies, it is not an exception to the law forbidding, which is universally valid and obliges each and everyone always and everywhere. Somehow it's not an exception to that. Okay, quote, the act of self-defense. Who are we quoting now? Oh, we're quoting St. Thomas Aquinas here. The act of self-defense. All right, I'm just going to point out here that there's a little bit of confusion here with regard to legitimate defense. I know that I've been told that St. Augustine actually said that, just war, just defense theory only applied to states, but said that if it came to personal self-defense, this was not a theory of personal self-defense, and that if it came to personal self-defense, one should die in imitation of their creator. I don't have the source for that. That makes it clear why they were quoting Thomas Aquinas here instead of St. Augustine. It is a little bit confusing though, because they don't clearly delineate between here's what with regard to self-defense as a person, here's with regard to self-defense with people and societies. It's just all kind of lumped together. The act of self-defense can have a double effect: the preservation of one's own life and the killing of the aggressor. The what ellipsis points, ... We don't know what was omitted here. The one is intended, the other is not. Okay, so it's not an exception to the prohibition against murder to legitimately defend people and societies. It's not an exception. And the reason it's not an exception is because of this thing called double effect. And now we're coming back to this idea of intention. We're getting some explanation of how the intention thing fits in. The one is intended, the other is not. So when you kill someone, or when you defend yourself, and you have to kill in self-defense, you're doing two things. There's an effect that's twofold. You're preserving your own life, and you are killing an aggressor. Okay, now we've got a new word here, aggressor, okay? Oops, we've got a new word, aggressor. So now that's a new idea that we've got to kind of figure in here, throw it in there into the mix with everything else. And because of double effect, it's like a side effect of preserving your life is to kill the aggressor. Okay. But you can only, I guess, by saying killing the aggressor, that means you can't kill the innocent person. They have to be threatening you. They have to be the aggressive ones. And when you kill them, there's this double effect. Okay. Love, let's move on to 2264. Love toward oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Love toward oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Okay. So now we've got two kinds of love. In 2264, we've got love towards oneself. And in, the only other time I heard love was love of enemies in 2262. We've got love of enemies. Okay. Love toward oneself remains a fundamental principle of morality. Therefore, it is legitimate to insist on respect for one's own right to life. Legitimate to insist on respect for one's own right to life. This brings us to another major matter of equivocation going on here that just makes it super, super unclear. I mean, they kind of interchangeably use words like legitimate, moral, immoral, sinful, what is required, what's a duty, what's a right, what's a grave offense. It's like, What is legitimate? I mean, what are we talking about? Legitimacy and illegitimacy. How does that relate to morality and immorality? How does that relate to sinfulness or, charity? One of these things said it was an offense against charity. Well, is that a sin? Um, what is love of self or enemies? What does that entail? What does that look like? What is required? If something is required or if it's a duty, does that mean that we have to do it in order to not be sinful? What is a right? Just because I have a right to something, does that mean that I am required to do it? What's a grave offense? Is that a sin? I mean, it's just so much terminology, and you cannot help but suspect that it's done on purpose to conflate and confuse. I mean, maybe not. Maybe it's not done on purpose. Maybe this was written by like 10 different people and there wasn't much time to review it or something. But it's like all of these different words, how are they related to each other? And the questions I would have would be, is it necessary to preserve your life if you love yourself? It says loving oneself is a principle of morality. So it's a moral thing to do, to love yourself. Does that mean you have to preserve your life? And if it's true, then is it necessary that if you love your enemy, you have to preserve your enemy's life? And if there's a different standard there for love of self and love of enemy, then where does that come from and what does that look like? So these things are just kind of thrown out there, and you can see how anybody could just sort of like run with any of these things. And there's so little attempt to draw any of this back, any of this just war, just defense stuff back to Jesus. It's really hard to reconcile if you love yourself, you have a right to preserve your life. I mean, that might be true that we have a right, but how does the rights that we have line up with the commands of Christ and the call of Christ, right? Like that's not really addressed here. Because Christ did say, if you try to save your life in this world, you will lose it. But if you lose your life for my sake, you will save it. A lot of just warists will tell you that he's not talking about your biological life. He's not talking about your ability to breathe and go on another day. He's talking about your wealth or your reputation or whatever you're attached to. But it seems pretty clear to me. And there's no attempt to try to bridge these things in the Catechism. And maybe that's because they don't know how. I really feel like it would have been more honest to call this section, instead of avoiding war, I think it should be called justifying war, because there's a lot more in here about how to justify what you feel you have to do to qualify for legitimate self-defense or unintentional killing or non-deliberate murder than there is really teaching anybody how to safeguard peace or how to work for peace or the rights, the duties and obligations of followers of Christ by way in terms of what he commanded. I think they should just call it justifying war. If someone who defends his life is not guilty of murder, even if he is forced to deal his aggressor a lethal blow. It's interesting the wording there because, okay, you're not guilty of murder if you're acting self-defense. Like we can all kind of understand that idea, but if you're forced to deal your aggressor a lethal blow, in what situations would somebody be forced to do that? Like, really, it's a genuine question. Under what situation would you be forced? Somebody is using violence against you to force you to kill someone else. And of course, I know the way that most people are thinking about this is like, well, you have to kill them if they're going to kill you. No, you don't. Like, you really don't. Like, let's just be honest here. You don't ever have to do anything. Like, you could choose to die instead of defending yourself, if that was your choice, if that was what your conscience told you. So if a man in self-defense uses more than necessary violence, it will be unlawful. Whereas if he repels force with moderation, his defense will be lawful. Okay. I guess that would kind of bring up a question of necessity. Okay, so now we're dealing with what does it mean to be forced to kill someone? And now we're going to deal with these ideas of necessity and then moderation. Okay, so each of these things is opening up. I mean, we have a whole conversation about necessity. What is necessary violence? And then there's a whole new kind of can of worms that we're opening here with this idea of moderation. So, but there's no real, like, okay, we understand what moderation is, but of course that's going to look different to everybody depending on what they think is necessary. Nor is it necessary for salvation that a man omit the act of moderate self-defense to avoid killing the other man, since one is bound to take more care of one's own life than of another's. So we're told that one is bound to take more care for his own life than the life of another. And yet I have a hard time reconciling that with the words of Christ. No one has greater love than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. You are my friends if you do what I command you. I no longer call you slaves, because a slave does not know what his master is doing. I have called you friends, because I have told you everything I have heard from my Father. 2265. Legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. But wait a minute. When I looked up war in the index, it said I found this section under duty to prevent war. So there's also a duty to prevent war. I would think that the best way to try to prevent war would be to refuse to participate in it. Imagine if Catholics all over the world, billions of them, refused to participate in war. That probably would be our duty. That would fulfill our duty to prevent war. But here we are told that actually we have a duty to, let's read that again. Legitimate defense can be not only a right, but a grave duty for one who is responsible for the lives of others. Well, we're all responsible for the lives of others. I mean, who is exempt from being responsible for the lives of others? And how do we reconcile this with what's in the gospel? Was Peter excused from this grave duty because he was not responsible for the lives of others? Did Jesus just let him off the hook from this grave duty? Is there any other way to defend that does not involve killing? I mean, this is another major question that's just like not answered. So it's not only a right, but a duty. Okay, so now we've got this idea of rights and duties. Do I have a right, do I have a duty to kill somebody to protect others? That's a question that's not really answered, but maybe we'll get to the answer. Well, maybe we'll figure it out. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor... Okay, now we're back to this idea of aggressor, and it specifies an unjust aggressor. So does that mean that there's such a thing as a just aggressor? Does that mean that there's a kind of aggression that is just? It's a question without an answer, but maybe we'll get the answer. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. Requires. Does that mean requires for what? For my salvation? Let's go back to salvation. When we were using the words like duty and require, is that related to salvation? Like I'm required to kill an unjust aggressor? I'm confused. The defense of the common good requires that an unjust aggressor be rendered unable to cause harm. By the way, I hope that you realize that my questions here are all rhetorical. I do realize, I know there's a provision for conscientious objection in the Catechism. If you flip around, you can find it. I'm aware of these things. These are rhetorical questions meant to kind of prove a point about the lack of clarity. And the many, many questions that go unanswered, the things that are insinuated, yet not spelled out, it's a problem. It's the JWQ. Actually, the JWP. It's the just war problem, not the just war question. For this reason, those who legitimately hold authority also have the right to use arms to repel aggressors against the civil community entrusted to their responsibility. Legitimately hold authority. Now we're coming up with another idea of authority and legitimate. So that means that there must be an illegitimate kind of authority. So who has legitimate authority and who has unjust? illegitimate authority. All right, under legitimate defense, we have 2266 and 2267 left. I'm going to skip that because it has more to do with like punishment and the rights of public authority to punish people, which is getting a little off track from war and what we're talking about here. Then the next part is intentional. We're not really talking about death penalty today, but intentional homicide, 2268. Oh, cool. So now we have a third term to throw into the mix. Homicide. Okay, new term. I guess we're going to try to figure out if that's the same thing as killing. I think it's the same thing as killing. It's got more in common with killing than murder, but again, why the constant switching of terms? The Fifth Commandment forbids direct and intentional killing as gravely sinful. Gravely sinful. Okay, now we're going somewhere new. This is 2268. Are there other kinds of killing that are sinful, but not gravely sinful? I mean, I think that's kind of a fair question to ask, right? Like, is there other killing that's like also sinful but not gravely sinful? I don't know. Maybe we'll figure that out. The murderer and those who cooperate voluntarily in murder commit a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. Murder is direct and intentional, but what the terms that we don't have here are deliberate and innocent. That doesn't come back here. The murderer, and also we're interchangeably using words killing and murder. So in the first sentence, the Fifth Commandment forbids direct and intentional killing as gravely sinful. Is that the definition of murder, though? Because in the very next sentence, it says the murderer, okay, and those who cooperate voluntarily in murder commit a sin that cries out to heaven for vengeance. I don't know what that means. I'm giving up. I've only had 1 cup of coffee today. I need like 4 espressos to be able to do this. Now we get into abortion. We're not even going to go there today, but I'm going to bring that up later on the podcast. Okay. Well, that was a nice little, that took me 40 minutes to get through the section on the Fifth Commandment, and I've still got some major questions. One major question I walk away with with regard to that section is killing evil. I mean, you know, if we could set aside the equivocation and all that stuff for a minute, it says thou shalt not kill, and the Catechism has left that as the translation. So my question would be, is killing evil? I don't think that is answered in the Catechism, but if you know that it is, let me know in the comments. I'd love to know the answer. All right, lots more questions indeed. This video originally went on for 40 more minutes. I'm going to stop it here, and hopefully you were taking notes. I'm not going to recap all the major questions, but I guess we'll find out when next time if they get answered. So the next time we're actually going to go back to that section on avoiding war, which is under safeguarding peace. So remember, we started there, and then the very first thing referenced the Fifth Commandment, so we jumped back to the Fifth Commandment to try to figure out that, and now we're going to jump back to the part that's more specifically about just war doctrine. If anybody can go through this section on the Fifth Commandment and draw me a Venn diagram that is accurate and makes sense and explains the relationship between all these things, I'll give you $1 million. Actually, that's a joke. I can't afford that. But if 1 million people sign up for my Iliad class, maybe I can afford to give you $1 million. In any case, I'd really appreciate it. That's your homework for today. See if you can figure it out, and I'll see you next time. God bless.